The book of Genesis initiates an account regarding the origins of existence within a structured narrative framework. Its opening verses describe a transition from primordial void into defined elements such as light and dark. These initial lines establish a chronological sequence before introducing any physical entities or beings in subsequent passages. To trace this origin, one must examine the source language where these concepts were first encoded. Biblical Hebrew relies on a system of trilateral roots, meaning most words are built from three consonants that share core meanings across different variations. This morphological structure allows for connections between seemingly unrelated terms within the same verse. Standard translations often treat each word as an isolated unit, missing the internal links present in the original script. Recognizing this root-based architecture is crucial for interpreting the opening verses accurately. Syntactic analysis indicates that the opening phrase functions as a dependent clause rather than an independent declaration. This grammatical arrangement establishes time before action occurs within the narrative sequence. The text implies creation is situated within a time frame, not necessarily preceding it entirely in isolation. Such structural dependencies suggest that the initial statement links directly into subsequent events without standing alone. Consequently, the concept of beginning operates relationally to what follows, rather than as an absolute starting point. Standard translations frequently render this opening verse as an isolated statement of origin, often treating it with the weight of a headline rather than narrative prose. This conventional reading depends significantly upon later editorial traditions applied to the original consonantal script found in ancient manuscripts. Vowel marks were added by scribes centuries after composition to guide pronunciation and nuance meaning without altering the written letters themselves. Consequently, modern readers often perceive the initial moment as a singular cosmological event based on these vocalic additions rather than inherent grammatical necessity alone. The divergence between how this text is visually transmitted versus its structural function creates a layer of complexity before examining specific vocabulary choices within the verse. Beyond individual vocabulary lies the conceptual framework governing how time is presented within this text. The opening declaration posits an absolute starting point distinct from cyclical or continuous patterns found in other regional narratives. This structure implies a linear progression initiated at a singular moment rather than an eternal recurrence of events. Consequently, every subsequent occurrence functions as part of a sequence originating from that specific divine command. Establishing this temporal boundary allows the narrative to function not merely as history, but as a structured revelation dependent on its initial conditions. The selected terminology functions as more than simple labels. They act as conceptual anchors within the narrative structure. Preserving their original semantic density when translating from an ancient tongue to modern understanding presents a significant challenge. In this specific context, language operates with precision that suggests each word carries multiple layers of implication regarding existence and origin. This inherent depth creates a barrier between surface observation and true comprehension, necessitating a deeper look at how meaning is generated within the text itself before structural mechanics are examined. Standard narrative conventions often commence with an active agent initiating a sequence of events. Here, however, the text establishes a precondition before any action is recorded. This initial configuration sets boundaries for reality rather than marking a moment on a timeline alone. The arrangement suggests that state precedes activity within this specific cosmological framework. By placing conditions prior to creation acts, the structure implies an underlying order exists independently of movement or change. Such positioning invites consideration of how existence itself is defined before any narrative progression begins. This opening segment functions as a temporal marker that precedes all narrative action within the book. Commonly translated as "in the beginning," the phrase establishes a chronological foundation before introducing any divine subject or verb. Such an arrangement implies that time is conceptualized independently of creation events in this specific linguistic structure. The focus remains on defining the starting point of existence rather than describing the immediate act of forming. Grammatically, this term functions with significant nominal weight within the sentence structure rather than serving purely as a temporal adverb. In broader biblical usage, words sharing this root often denote priority or essence before they indicate chronology. This distinction shifts the analytical focus from when creation occurred to what was prioritized at that moment. The linguistic evidence suggests an emphasis on quality over quantity in these opening verses. Following the establishment of temporal priority, attention turns to the agent initiating this sequence. The text identifies the divine actor through a term possessing distinct morphological features. Although constructed with a plural suffix typically indicating multiple entities, usage within this opening statement aligns it with singular agency and supreme authority. This linguistic choice distinguishes the speaker from later specific appellations found throughout Scripture, suggesting an emphasis on generic power rather than personal identity at this precise moment of origin. The grammatical structure prioritizes the capability of the agent before detailing the method of execution. Grammatically, this opening declaration stands in isolation before introducing any divine agent or action. By prioritizing the temporal marker over the subject of creation, the text establishes a condition that must be acknowledged prior to understanding the event itself. Prior to any action being described, the text establishes an absolute temporal anchor. The opening term denotes not merely a sequence of events, but the inception of chronology itself. Unlike cyclical models prevalent in ancient thought where history repeats without origin, this phrasing implies time possesses a singular starting point. It suggests that measurement and duration commence at this specific juncture rather than existing eternally beforehand. In its original syntax, the opening noun lacks the definite article standard in Hebrew for specific references. This grammatical omission creates a tension between form and function within the text. While the context implies an absolute reference, the syntax treats the concept as inherent rather than designated by markers of identity. Such precision suggests that this moment is not merely one event among many possibilities, but represents the fundamental condition required for all subsequent events to exist. Grammatical analysis highlights a persistent pattern where this plural designation is paired exclusively with singular verbal conjugations in the narrative sequence. This structural choice establishes a tension within the language itself, separating the concept of identity from the mechanics of action. The text presents a subject that appears multiple but acts as one source without merging or dividing. Such consistency across the opening verses suggests an intentional design rather than random linguistic variation. By positioning this title at the very commencement, subsequent descriptions are required to operate within its defined parameters. The identity presented here sets a standard for understanding divine agency throughout the entire creation account. Grammatically, the opening phrase functions less as a marker of time than a declaration of absolute authority. It places the divine subject in a position antecedent to all subsequent events, implying that reality is contingent upon this presence rather than simultaneous with it. This structural priority suggests an existence independent of the material world being described. At its core lies a specific Hebrew root that encompasses both the moment of origin and hierarchical rank within ancient syntax. This linguistic structure implies that the concept of creation is not merely an entry point, but holds precedence over all subsequent developments. Consequently, it establishes a foundational priority where existence itself depends on this initial declaration before any other action occurs. Hebrew syntax differs fundamentally from English conventions in establishing temporal sequence and agency. Certain grammatical markers allow for interpretations where the opening verse serves as a title rather than an action statement within the narrative flow. This structural distinction suggests that what appears to be a definitive declaration of origin may instead function as a thematic heading preceding detailed events. The precise placement of these linguistic elements becomes critical when determining whether the text describes absolute beginnings or conditional contexts. The initial phrase presents a semantic challenge that transcends simple translation choices. While commonly rendered as an absolute start, linguistic analysis reveals this term can also function to denote preeminence or priority within a sequence, rather than a definitive moment of origin. This distinction shifts the focus from when creation occurred to what holds primary status in the cosmic order. Such ambiguity forces an examination of whether the narrative establishes time itself or merely identifies the first action among potential precedents, complicating any singular interpretation of the opening declaration. While individual words may carry interpretive weight, their arrangement creates a structural foundation for the entire narrative arc. The initial phrase sets conditions that extend beyond simple description into chronological establishment. This design ensures that what follows is understood as part of an ordered progression rather than random occurrence. Evidence indicates this opening mechanism serves to link creation events with subsequent historical timelines seamlessly. Consequently, the text operates through internal continuity even before external theological frameworks are considered by later readers. Following the initial declaration of origin, the text immediately shifts focus from abstract existence to vocal command. In this narrative structure, sound is introduced before light itself takes shape within the void. This sequencing implies that language operates as a generative force rather than simply describing what already exists. By placing speech prior to physical manifestation, the account positions communication at the foundation of material reality. It suggests that order emerges through instruction, establishing a causal link between divine utterance and the formation of cosmic structure before any specific object is named or defined. The opening phrase in the beginning establishes a definitive starting point for history, rather than an eternal cycle of existence. Within this framework, reality is not presented as self-sustaining from eternity past, but initiated by a singular event recorded in text. This structural choice implies that time itself has a commencement marker tied directly to the narrative voice. Consequently, all subsequent events are measured relative to this initial declaration. Such a construction differentiates the account from cosmologies, where matter and divinity coexist without temporal boundaries. Instead, it posits a distinct moment of inception that anchors the timeline for everything that follows. Within the original Semitic context, the opening phrase operates with a semantic weight that transcends mere temporal sequence. Linguistic scholarship indicates this root term conveys notions of priority, headship, and preeminence alongside chronological beginning. In ancient manuscript traditions, such vocabulary often serves to establish sovereignty over what follows, rather than simply marking a starting point on a timeline. This distinction reorients the reader's focus from when creation occurred to who holds authority within it. The text thus presents itself not as an event in time, but as the foundational source of all subsequent order and existence. Within the opening narrative, verbal commands are consistently positioned before material reality takes shape. The syntax suggests that existence responds to instruction rather than generating itself autonomously. This grammatical structure distinguishes the speaker from the spoken word, implying a separation between divine authority and physical execution within the creative act. Such linguistic patterns indicate an agent who initiates order while remaining distinct from the chaos being organized. The initial declaration functions as a temporal anchor, distinguishing time itself as a created dimension rather than an eternal constant. This linguistic choice implies that duration commenced at this specific moment of utterance, marking the transition from non-existence into measurable history. Such framing suggests the opening phrase was selected to define not just space or matter, but the very concept of sequence and order within the narrative structure. The opening syntax of Genesis establishes more than chronology. It sets a grammatical precedent for authority within the text itself. Specific lexical choices regarding beginning carry theological weight beyond simple sequence, functioning as an anchor point that creates structural expectation. The vocabulary used to describe creation mirrors terminology found in later texts concerning completion and return. Consequently, the linguistic architecture of these opening verses does not merely introduce history, but establishes a framework where origin dictates outcome. The initial phrase of Genesis presents a grammatical structure that defies simple categorization within standard literary conventions. This opening clause functions less as an isolated statement and more as a conditional anchor for the events described immediately after. Linguistic examination reveals that the specific terminology used establishes parameters for causality rather than just chronology. Such precision suggests the author selected these terms to convey complex theological concepts through syntax alone. The resulting ambiguity invites readers to look beyond surface meaning when interpreting foundational claims. The opening declaration identifies two distinct realms, representing the totality of existence rather than specific locations within it. This duality functions as a comprehensive descriptor for all physical and spiritual domains before subsequent verses divide them further. Evidence indicates this pairing serves to establish complete scope immediately, ensuring no aspect of reality remains outside the originating event's influence prior to detailed differentiation. The opening text functions as a structural anchor within Hebrew grammar, establishing authority before action begins. Such linguistic density suggests meaning is layered rather than linear. Decoding this syntax requires looking beyond surface translation to grasp the intentional weight placed on existence itself. The syntax places the temporal marker at the forefront, preceding any mention of an agent or action within the clause. This structural choice establishes time not as a pre-existing backdrop, but as a dimension with a definitive commencement linked to the initial decree. Consequently, chronology is presented as subject to this command rather than existing prior to it. The arrangement creates a boundary between the void and the first moment of order, anchoring all subsequent history within a linear progression initiated at that precise instant, without relying on external temporal references. Within comparative analysis of ancient literature, narratives typically introduce a protagonist or setting before establishing action. In this instance, however, the concept of inception serves as the primary subject matter rather than an agent performing it. This linguistic construction treats the idea of origin not merely as a reference point, but as a substantive element governing what follows. By anchoring the narrative in this absolute state without reference to prior conditions, the text implies that existence emerges from silence and void directly into being. The phrase operates independently of external historical context within its own grammatical framework, presenting creation as an event defined solely by its initiation point, rather than preceding causes or preparatory stages mentioned elsewhere at this juncture. The syntactic arrangement of the first verse places significant emphasis on the relationship between divine action and temporal origin. Hebrew grammar allows this opening statement to function as a dependent clause rather than an independent sentence, shifting the focus from absolute creation to a specific time frame within a larger continuum. This grammatical possibility suggests that the initial declaration may instead serve as a prologue, introducing subsequent events without establishing total precedence over all prior reality. Consequently, the focus shifts from when creation occurred to who initiated it with absolute authority. The syntactical arrangement places divine agency at the forefront before any temporal measurement begins. Rather than describing an entry into time, the opening phrase asserts a foundation outside of history itself. This distinction transforms the narrative from a simple record of events into a theological declaration. It implies that existence relies on this initial assertion of power, rather than merely following a sequential progression. Beyond establishing authority, the opening construction reveals a unique relationship between language and matter. In many historical narratives, words describe an already existing state of affairs. Here, however, the grammatical structure suggests that speech acts as the primary catalyst for physical manifestation. The text implies no separation between command and execution. The utterance itself carries the capacity to alter reality instantly. This perspective treats vocabulary not merely as symbols for communication, but as functional instruments capable of shaping substance from nothingness. Consequently, the boundary between description and action dissolves entirely in this linguistic framework.